So greetings. We're going to continue with our work on finding alignment in sitting and then eventually move to standing. Come on over here and let's take a look at the skeleton. So here's a pelvis. Pelvis bone has two sides, a right and a left. If you want to know the technical terms, they're called ilia, plural, ilium, one ilium, which is why the joint in the back is called the sacroiliac joint, where the sacrum, which is the bone where the spine fuses and becomes the tailbone. There's the sacrum and there's the sacroiliac joint, where the ilium bone of the pelvis meets the sacrum, okay? And then I think we already said this is your pubic bone right here. Now look at this interesting thing. Can you see that the femur bones are not straight up and down? The femur bones are the thigh bones. So can you see that, I have a new tripod, that this bone goes out at an angle and then into a hip joint. That is the hip joint. That's the hip socket right there. It's a very shallow socket that allows the hip joint to move in many, many ways, okay? And this bone out here, so sometimes we call the hip a lot of things. When we're doing the hokey pokey and we put our hands on our hips, we're actually putting our hands up here. Put your hands on your hips, that your tap tap da 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 da, right? But if we're having a dress made or pants made, this is the widest part. It's usually wider than the pelvis itself. So hips are measured by a tailor here because that's the widest part. Those aren't hips either. This is called the trochanter bone, or it's just part of the femur, but it's called the trochanter. Trochanter means to run in Latin, so that's why it makes sense. But here is your hip joint, right here. Look how narrow it is. Look at how close it is. Here's the edge of your pubis. Here's your hip joint. And you can see, I'm gonna back up now a little bit with the camera. You can see that when I flex my hip to sit, that this joint goes through a pretty significant change. So I'm going to back up further. Here we would be in sitting. And we would have our sits bones down here underneath us. But look at how close our sits bones are to our hip joint. Hip joint, hip joint. The sits bones that we've talked about sitting on. Yeah? And as we know, the pelvis is where all of your power comes from because that's what transfers the force from the ground. So let's talk about some interesting things here. So why is this bone bent this way? Well, if you think about it, the force from the ground is coming up through two legs and it has to be transferred to one spine. So if the force of the ground force that's coming up can be angled inward here and here, then it spirals around this weird shaped bone. Now you know why this bone is shaped this way, because it's shaped that way to transfer the forces where the strongest part of the force and the thickest part of the force can take that force to the sacrum and from the sacrum up the spine. So force comes up, angles inward, whooshes around here like water does in a basin, meets the SI joint, the sacroiliac joint, and goes up the spine, ideally, okay? So let's try a couple of things. Come onto your back for a minute and then we're gonna do some sitting. So the first thing you're gonna do, please, is to lie on your back. Let your legs long. Oh, I love this new tripod. And just settle into the ground a little bit. And now put your hands on your hips to do the hokey pokey. There's your ilia, plural, ilium, singular. Put your hands down here. If you bend your knee, you'll feel the bony bone that sticks out. Find your trochanter on both sides. Your hip muscles, your gluteals, your deep lateral rotators, all attach around this bone. It's a very important part. Okay? And then just go ahead and settle into the ground. And what I'd like you to do is something that is really, you're not going to see anything on the screen. I'd like you to glacially, meaning an observer can't see it. Like you want to conceal that you're moving from someone who's watching you. Glacially, you're going to roll your right leg inward. The whole leg is going to turn inward on the heel, rolling on the heel from wherever it starts. So blah, 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 fast forward, then glacially back. Again, as if you wanted to conceal that you were moving from someone else. It should give you a really strong sense of where your hip joint is. You're resting on your sacrum now, which is the back of your pelvis. So after you did that on one side, then I'd like you to do it on the other side, please. So you roll in slowly. I'm fast forwarding so you can see, even though there's really nothing to see. If you'd like to do it a couple more times, feel free if you're still not clear about your hip joint. And then bend your knees and just see what that feels like. See if you can find the sides of your pelvis. See if you can find your pubic bone between your two legs. And see if you can imagine where your hip joint might be, deep inside there, but very narrow, much narrower than we might imagine. Then roll yourself to your side, please. Come up to sitting. And would you find your sits bones like we did last week. Find your feet. Let your arms rest on. Make sure your feet are under. You can't see this, but your feet are under your knees and you're on your sits bones. And then, excuse me, would you do something that we call unweighting? So that's the precursor of lifting. It's the moment before anything happens. So would you unweight your right leg and foot as if you were going to pull your knee towards your chest? Now there's a ton of time before any skin leaves the floor. You want to take that long with that. If you get tired, just let it back down slowly. Remember, if we want to increase sensation, we have to slow the movement down because the nervous system doesn't move at the speed, our sensory motor system doesn't move at the speed that thinking does. So if we want to really sense, we need to slow down. So fast forward, you're going to unweight both legs and then not to the point that your knee comes off the floor, up, or your foot comes off the floor. So it looks like nothing is happening. I'm unweighting my legs right now. You can barely see anything. Then you're going to do the other. You're going to push your foot into the floor. And don't think about pushing down. Think about pushing into the floor like you push into a diving board. So that when you push into the floor with your left leg, you can feel that force coming up through the left side of your spine. When you push through your right foot, you can feel the force coming up through the right side of your spine. And then try it with both. See if that helps your sitting any. We're going to continue with this for several lessons and learn how to come to stand from sitting. So there'll be a part 2. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you enjoy this. Take care.